Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's an enormous pleasure to be introduced by the Honorable Dr. Swapan Dasgupta. Swapan, it's a pleasure to know myself in your hands during that discussion, and let me say it's a pleasure to always be with the India Foundation. Not only, they do conferences not only in Delhi, but also, as I just mentioned to Ramadav, I greatly enjoyed the conference in the Andamans. And if I had explained to my government I need to travel to the Andamans, they would have said he has definitely been too long in India. But, and that will have a connection with what I say later on. The Andamans are of enormous strategic importance for the security in Asia in years to come. My first experience when I came here was I had to organize our bilateral intergovernmental consultations. Chancellor Merkel was to come only 6 weeks after I handed over my credentials to the President of India. And one needs a lot of nerves because the notion of time in this country is a different one from Germany. And when all those who give me instructions until what time we need what element of the program fixed, and when the program is fixed, in the end, there's a certain gap. And that has to be covered with good nerves and humor. And, but I always told my staff, don't lose your nerves. In the end, and that is a great gift of India, innovation, creativeness, inspiration, and joint effort will lead to an enormous success. And there it was. The last of the 18 MOUs we signed in October 2015 was negotiated while Chancellor Merkel was on the plane. And she came off the plane and said, "Are we ready to sign?" And I said, "Yes." And we said, "Incredible India." So, I want to talk about first bilateral relations and secondly about security in Asia. And you will understand how it's really interconnected. I will not bore you by telling you all the various aspects of bilateral relations, how many students study in Germany, etc., but I want to talk about conceptually about bilateral relations. In every country, the fundamental role of foreign policy is to serve national interests. The role of foreign policy is to serve national interests. And in India, the national interest is its development, its growth, its aspiration to become a global player. And in Germany, it's the welfare of the people, retaining economic well-being, an open society, civil liberties, etc., etc. The fascinating aspect of our bilateral relations between Germany and India is that there is no contradiction of interests in pursuing foreign policy together. Prime Minister Modi, when he visited Berlin end of May last year, said Germany and India are made for each other. You know, I couldn't coin it in a better way. And why is it so? Why is there no contradiction of interests in our bilateral relations? First, from the German perspective. Germany's welfare depends on international trade, on free trade. And this is why we are so grateful that the Prime Minister made such a strong pitch for free trade in Davos just weeks ago. We have little natural resources. We must import them. Our domestic market is comparatively small. We must export our products. So we depend on free trade. And by the way, that holds true also with some ramifications in the detail for all European Union countries. We depend on free trade. From India's perspective, to develop fast by inclusive economic growth, and also in order to narrow the gap between India and China, India's economy needs more integration into the international markets. At present, India's economy still is largely dependent on the domestic market, but in the path to become a global player, to become a very more modern economy, it will have to look more beyond its domestic market. So India equally depends on free trade, and India needs to acquire technologies in many areas. In some areas, India is leading, is at the edge of development of technology. In other areas, it needs to acquire technologies in many areas. And India needs to attract foreign direct investment. Now, we both depend on international free trade. 5 conclusions I offer you from that. The first conclusion, it explains why Germany alone is India's 6th largest trading partner. It explains why the EU is India's largest trading and investment partner. And as I recently wrote in an article jointly with my French colleague, Alexandre Ziegler, it will remain the largest Indian trading partner after Brexit. Secondly, my second conclusion, India and Germany, we sit in the same boat when it comes to defend free trade. We're absolutely in the same boat. We also have to defend it jointly against noises from a country on the eastern side of the United States. Third conclusion, there is still ample room for improvement. The volume of German trade with China is 10 times higher than the volume of German trade with India. And we certainly, with India's success in economic growth, want to balance this in the future along with India's growth. Fourth conclusion, and most importantly, it explains why Germany wants India's success. This is why we are India's 2nd largest bilateral donor. If we want India's success, we do something about this. And we are India's 2nd largest bilateral donor in economic development cooperation. And India, from our perspective, is our largest recipient of economic development cooperation funds. So annually, over 1 billion euros. And presently, we have in the pipeline from which we now implement economic development projects, we have currently 180 projects, we have 8.3 billion euros to be dispersed in India. So this is the German taxpayers' investment into India's success. So bottom line, we want India's success. 5th point, we both have homework to do. On both sides, because we are huge trading partners, we need to sit down and restart negotiations on an EU-India free trade agreement, including investment protection. Such a free trade agreement, FTA, is not just about tariffs and regulations. It's about shaping globalization. If you want to shape globalization, you write it down as large actors in a globalized world. You write down the rules and the standards in your trading relationship. And by writing it down, you shape international agreements on free trade, and you set precedents for other trading partners to do the same. If you don't sit down and write it into an agreement, others will shape globalization in their sense. So it makes a lot of sense, because we share such a large trade volume, that we actually shape the standards of our goods and services that we trade, and that we shape the rules and set an example for other trading partners. It's in our interest to shape the future of international free trade, and I must say I just met with the Minister for Trade, Mr. Prabhu, and I mentioned to him that we, as Germany, will lean heavily on the EU Commission to take up negotiations, not just take another round of stock taking, but to take up negotiations with this government, with his ministry and the Ministry of Finance. It's in our common interest. Now to my second large area, security in Asia. And you will understand in a minute why all this is so interconnected. You must understand another reason why Germany has an interest in India being successful in becoming a global player is the following. We all need think tanks, MEAs all over the world. We all need to sit down and do a sober analysis about which are the countries in the world with which we share fundamental principles. On the domestic front, with which countries do we share fundamental principles as democracy, rule of law, free speech, open society? And when you think about it, the number of these countries around the world are, let's say, limited. I served as ambassador to the United Nations. When you think about your countries, your counterparts, and where they come from, and what the rules inside their countries are, and what the real life inside their countries are, they're all called democratic. We need to do a sober analysis. Who are the countries with which we share these principles? Domestically, on the four I mentioned. The other aspect, with which countries do we share the fundamental conviction that international order needs to be a rules-based international order? And when you look at the number of countries who believe in it and act accordingly, the number is limited. Why is it so important to do this analysis and see who are these countries with which we share these convictions? First point, and this is my personal conviction, in the long run, only with such countries you can join hands and stabilize the international order, be it security in Europe or be it security in Asia. India, as it is on the way to become a global player, is such a partner. And we consider India as very important as a net provider of stability in Asia. Second reason why is it so important? Because of the huge challenges to stability, not only in Europe, but also in Asia, or let's say open questions in the security and stability in Asia. When I name those, I mention North Korea, but I leave it aside, because it would be an extra chapter. The elephant in the room is obviously China. How do we all deal with a more assertive China? And here we must be clear in our analysis, above all on OBOR. I was very impressed by how concisely the new Foreign Secretary Gokhale defined the central questions linked to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I will briefly quote him. The Foreign Secretary said, when he was still Secretary of Trade, is the process demand-oriented? Is the process consultative? Is the process fair, including free competition? Is the process compatible with existing international frameworks? Does the process respect sovereignty and territorial integrity of third countries? I believe that these observations by Foreign Secretary Gokhale are most pertinent. The bottom line is whether the rules-based international order is respected or not. That's the bottom line. Whenever a country tried to set rules unilaterally, this meant huge risks for the international system as a whole, and in my opinion, it's short-sighted. Because the relations between states are multifaceted. And even large countries, very influential countries, mighty countries, have aspects in their international relations where they are in a weaker position or in a demandeur position. So to say I can leave rules aside in this aspect of my relations is short-sighted because, for two reasons. First, because in the long run you might not be in the same position all the time, and even in the short term there are other aspects of international relations where you might need the support of other countries. So the bottom line is whether the rules-based international order is respected or not. Germany and India are on the same page here. We both agree on the utmost importance to safeguard the rules-based international order. Unfortunately, we have a challenge here in the South China Sea. Our joint strong support for UNCLOS and the law of the seas is most important in this respect. And here, Indian, German, and European interests do converge, especially with respect to the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean today sees more than 60% of the world trade passing through its waters. 60% of world trade pass through the waters of the Indian Ocean. Germany, I don't know if you know this, has the second largest shipping fleet in the world. We are a shipping nation. We're not only an export world champion, but we are also a shipping nation. And having the second largest shipping fleet in the world, and India, we both definitely cannot afford to be negligent to the international governance of such important waters. Both India and Germany, indeed also the European Union, are committed to the idea of multilateral security in the Indian Ocean. And I name three aspects. We are jointly engaged, and that is little known here, in the anti-piracy missions such as the EU mission Atalanta. India contributed actively to EU Atalanta in the Gulf of Aden to fight piracy. Second aspect, we are, Germany, also supporting the emergence of a regional framework for managing the Indian Ocean. IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, is an emerging international forum in this regard, and practically Germany is financing its secretariat. Also little known. Third aspect, another area of cooperation in the Indian Ocean would be international cooperation on maritime domain awareness. We all have an interest to see which ships are using the Indian Ocean, and white shipping agreements and other forms of collaboration would be an excellent idea. So, there are many other areas of Indo-German relations that remain and I cannot fully cover here. I'm not talking about fight against international terrorism, where we cooperate. A joint interest in stabilizing Afghanistan, a joint interest in keeping alive the agreement with Iran on the non-development of nuclear weapons, a joint interest in the reform of the functioning of the United Nations, including the Security Council, a strong German support for Indian membership in the Nuclear Suppliers Group. I've not mentioned these areas because it would take too long. I only wanted to sketch out the areas where the German and often European and Indian interests converge in areas of foreign policy, and this was the topic of the seminar. If I wanted to go into details on bilateral relations, including economy, economic cooperation, trade and manufacturing, transport, railways, science, culture, student exchange, and others, I would keep you here for the rest of the afternoon.